Hi guys, and welcome to a Wisdom Wednesday book review edition of Chris Beardsley's Strength is Specific. Now, if you've seen people talking about sports specificity on social media, you'll realise that the term is poorly understood, often bastardised, and sometimes used as a marketing ploy. So if you want to learn more about sports specificity and how strength is specific, keep watching. So Chris Beardsley's Strength is Specific book details at least 8 variables that make strength specific. Now, oftentimes sports coaches and technical coaches, especially parents of youth athletes who have their son or daughter see a strength and conditioning coach, struggle to get their head around the fact that a movement can look nothing like the sport and yet improve the sport. And the reasons for this are as follows. So one of the factors is contraction mode. So for example, is the muscle lengthening, shortening, or staying the same length in the exercises you are doing in the gym? For example, if you're a gymnast trying to improve your handstand, and that's an isometric contraction, it makes sense that you would use movements of an isometric nature. The second thing to note is the contraction velocity or speed. So for example, how fast are you moving in your exercises in the strength and conditioning suite versus in your sporting environment? Now, that's not to say that heavy slow lifts don't have their place, they absolutely do, but for most athletes you're going to want to use something known as plyometrics, which is going to be explosive hopping or jumping movements. The next factor is force vector. So this is the direction of force application. So a lot of movements in the gym are up and down because this is the plane of motion where it's going to be easiest to build strength. However, it's important to know that sport is not played all the time in an up and down plane or the sagittal plane. You're going to want elements of lateral movement, so for example lateral hop and holds. You're going to want horizontal force production, so looking at stuff like forward jumping or bounding, rotational exercises or the ability to control and resist rotation, as well as the up and down movements, which are so prominent in most strength and conditioning programs. Another important thing to note is joint angle. Now, there's a time and a place for deep squats, and there's a time and a place for quarter squats. Quarter squats have been shown to enhance jumping and sprinting performance more so than arse to grass squats, but that's not to say that they are inherently better. It's just simply the timing of when you use either. So for example, further away from competition, let's say you're a basketballer, you might use arse to grass squats because you're far away from competition and you want to develop general mobility and strength and almost give yourself a buffer of movement. As you get closer towards the sporting event, that's when you might start to look at more sports specific joint angles. Load is another key consideration. So for example, a rugby player who's used to encountering those heavy loads is going to need to get strong simply so it can underpin the amount of power that they can produce against the body mass of another person in rugby. That said though, it's also important to consider that even though someone like a squash player doesn't encounter heavy loads the same way a rugby player does, strength will underpin your ability to be powerful. So it's not as simple as saying, well, I never encounter heavy loads, therefore I don't need to lift heavy. Secondly, the amount of force applied through the body through something like sprinting or jumping is, depending on your skill level, is going to be anywhere upwards of 4 times body weight. In fact, studies I've seen on elite triple jumpers have managed to find forces as high as 17 times body weight. So if you want to build resilient athletes, if you want to reduce the risk of injury, no two ways about it, you have to strength train. Stability. Now this is an interesting one because when people with stability, they automatically think BOSU balls and training on unstable surfaces. The fact is you can make a lift more unstable simply by performing it in a staggered stance, such as a split squat, or performing it on one leg, so a pistol squat, a single leg squat. And the movement pattern. Now this is the one that, this is normally the first variable and the only variable people see when it comes to strength and conditioning programs. They think because something looks like the sport, For example, I've seen a lot of stuff with social media where people just put a band around a movement and then mimic the movement pattern, for example in tennis or badminton, and automatically think it's going to transfer. Transfer training and specificity are two very different things, although you can see why some people get confused with them. Something that is highly specific and that ticks all 8 of these variables in relation to a sport is typically going to be the sporting movement itself. Now, the more specific you try and get with a movement, the harder it is to overload it. Whereas the more general a movement is, so let's say you're only picking 1 or 2 of these variables, the easier it is to overload it. For example, if we look at a boxer and their punch, you can't, and you just say, right, we'll put dumbbells in his hands and have him punching with dumbbells, you might use maybe 1-2 kilos. Whereas if, for example, you're like, right, the force production mainly comes from the legs. How are we going to best overload the legs? We're going to use something like a barbell squat. Again, you'll notice that they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. Finally, you need to look at which key muscles are contributing to that movement. So for example, if you're trying to get a kayaker stronger, then it doesn't really make much sense to focus most of your energies on their squat, because that's not a key muscle really used in their sport. So as I said, even though there's 8 variables, the ones that people tend to focus on is the movement pattern. However, just because it looks like the sport doesn't mean it necessarily improves performance. Now let's take the example of boxing with dumbbells. This is something that even elite boxers do, but I'm sure if you press them for an answer, they probably really wouldn't be able to explain it too well. Now, when you're holding dumbbells, gravity is acting down, so the force vector is down, and when you think about punching, we're not really operating in that up and down plane. Whereas something like a medicine ball punch, yes, the medicine ball is acting down, but you've got an acceleration phase as you release it. So the contraction velocity of something like a medicine ball punch is very high. Whereas when you throw a punch with a dumbbell, if you don't slow down at the end phase, unless you release the dumbbell, which I've had happen in boxing, and it hit the back of my head as another lad threw the dumbbell at me. But unless you're releasing the dumbbell, you're actually slowing down at the point of the movement when you need to be most explosive. So the contraction velocity of a dumbbell punch is slow in comparison to an actual punch and in comparison to a medicine ball punch, and the force vector is different than what it should be when you're punching. So just because it looks like the sport, and just because some people on Instagram might tell you that punching with dumbbells is specific, doesn't mean it's going to transfer. Now the next interesting thing is something that doesn't look like the sport but does transfer. So if you had a footballer who had injured their hamstrings, and if you want to know more about bulletproofing your hamstrings, you can check out my video on this topic specifically. But when they're first in the initial phase of their rehab, they're going to be looking at probably a lot of isolated hamstrings work. It's not going to look like the sport. In fact, there's loads of research saying that the Nordic hamstring curl can prevent hamstring injuries because it develops strength in the eccentric phase of terminal extension. So a lot of times when hamstrings get pulled, it's because athletes don't have the strength to break the speed at which they're running effectively. Whereas eccentric, so this is the lowering phase of the Nordic, builds that eccentric strength that athletes often lack, which often leads to their hamstrings getting pulled. Now, as the hamstrings and glutes are key contributors to sprinting speed, an exercise like the Nordic, which heavily eccentrically overloads the hamstring and glutes, has been shown to improve sprinting speed. Looks nothing like being on the pitch, looks nothing like sprinting, but because it overloads those 2 variables, i.e. the contraction mode useful for sprinting and the key muscle groups, it has been shown to improve sprinting performance. Equally, machines aren't wholly good or bad, it just depends on the context. So in early phase rehab, you probably will be using machines in the initial phase. So key questions. What made me decide to read this book? Chris Beardsley has a ton of research on strength training and what makes it specific. A specific chapter in the book that I like is strength training for sprinting, strength training for change of direction performance, and strength training for jumping. Anyone who realizes that the concept of sport specificity is poorly understood should buy this book. My key take homes from the book is that we need to look beneath the bonnet of an exercise rather than just assuming that it will transfer to performance. As I've said, exercises that don't look like the sport can transfer, and exercises that do look like the sport might not necessarily transfer. It all depends on which of those variables you are trying to isolate. In terms of applying these key take-homes, it's a reminder that whilst building strength is important, how you build that strength, so looking at factors like range of motion and not just using deep squats, for example, for the sake of it, looking at how you build that strength is important. Are you building it with speed? Are you building it through a given range of motion? Are you looking at specific joint angles? All of these factors are important for an athlete. So finally, who should buy this book? Any technical coach wanting to understand more about strength and conditioning, any strength and conditioning coach wanting to understand more about the bastardized term that is specificity. I hope you found this Wisdom Wednesday book review edition useful. If there's any books you'd like me to review, please get in touch. Or equally, if you've got any questions for me, please find me on your preferred channel. If you've liked the video and watched this far, please subscribe and leave me a comment down below. All the very best. Catch you in the next video.